Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
There is this terrible problem in journalism that you're trying to combine two things. You're trying to combine the storytelling, really, this kind of basic narrative with beginnings, middles, and ends, turning points, crises, confrontation, argument, and all that sort of stuff. But the unfortunate fact is that so much of a public conversation revolves around numbers. And you can go so far in journalism trying to ignore this, but eventually it catches up with you and you have to address the numbers. And so there's this rather unfortunate collision of storytelling and numbers I think in journalism, but actually in the way that we perceive a lot of the everyday hazards and dangers in life. So if I tell you a little story, this story is going to shape your perception of danger. Even by announcing and introducing the story, we're going to shape your perception of the risks. We start to introduce framing effects as soon as we start to tell a story. So here's a little story about Casualty. You'll recognize this story. If you've ever seen Casualty, you'll understand this scene. That the family is gathered around the breakfast table when the old man coughs. Now, you know that in the world at large, a cough is not a statistically significant event, but you're watching Casualty. And so you know that this is a triple heart bypass. And you're right, actually, you're absolutely right, it is a triple heart. That's an old John Sargent joke, by the way. By the end, the guy's going to be on the slab, and you know the interesting thing is, once you think you understand the shape of the story, you interpret all the events differently. Your perception of all the risks, of all the factors which may play into this story, changes, so that a cough can assume enormous significance, because you know that within this kind of format, that's what coughs do. They signal some event. Because you've been framed, essentially, you've been given a construct for interpreting the information in this particular way. And this is what stories do. They have a beginning, and as soon as we have this beginning, they frame the way that we take in the information. You just sort of think, well, what's the alternative? What possible story can we tell which isn't about the things that happen? Because this is the obvious bias in storytelling. You tell stories about things that happen. And the thing that happens is the cough, which signifies the guy having a heart attack or whatever, triple heart bypass and so on. Well, there is a way, but it makes a kind of funny sort of storytelling. So I'm going to give you an example from Mitchell and Webb, the comedians. This is a sketch called The Man Who Had a Cough, and it's just a cough, and he's fine. So this is the kind of the storytelling, really, which probably we should do rather more of. Anyway, here they are. Just allow your expectations to build.
I do so love you.
Darling, you all right?
It's just a cough. I'll be fine.
Oh, Adam, it's so good to see you.
You too, honey. If only I could shake this blasted cough. It's such a bore.
Yes. Of course, darling.
Well, yes, it's just a cough.
Oh.
Do you want to come back to mine?
Look, I thought you had TB.
TB? No, I'd mentioned that. God. No, it's just a cough.
Right. Wish I hadn't let you do me now.
Charming. Wonderful stuff.
Thank you.
I mean, it raises slightly entertaining possibilities about the balance of news journalism. If we reported faithfully the incidents of events and non-events, but it is odd that we don't really even have a language for thinking about things that don't happen. The thesaurus and the dictionary are very thin on alternatives for non-events. But they're actually a critical part of understanding the balance of probabilities, because every probability is really a fraction. There's both a probability of the event happening and a probability of a non-event. It's 30 out of 100 or whatever it is. It's 30%, something of that sort. And the whole storytelling emphasis is on the one exceptional event. Sometimes it's 1, sometimes it is 10% or whatever. But that's what stories are. And we're possibly not quite aware, as I think possibly not as aware as we should be, that we do have a choice about this. That we can become more aware of the sort of Pygmalion alternatives, that the flower seller is never discovered and, given elocution lessons, and the princess is never, there's a phrase for this which is called denominator neglect. And the idea that, when we tell stories about things, particularly risks, what we're concentrating on is the stuff that happens, the people to whom the bad stuff happens. These are the events, these are what stories are all about. And the alternative, as I say, is slightly hard to contemplate. You can't quite see it, can you, somehow? and yet, probabilistically, the best description, for example, of the dangers of skiing is somebody skiing. Fine, dare we say it, enjoying themselves. That's the best representation of somebody skiing, because it's not falling off a precipice. And yet if you say, what are the risks of skiing, we imagine falling off a precipice. Obviously, really, the risks of bad things happening are overwhelmingly quite small. Most of the risks today have diminished massively. The sort of risks that we worry about a lot when we're taking our kids to school and thinking the traffic's going to mow them down and that sort of thing. And so they are a tiny, tiny part of that fraction. The denominator is huge. And yet we don't tend to think of it that sort of way. We think about the risks, as I say, the emphasis on the event, the bad thing happening. As soon as we talk about risk, we're thinking about the bad thing happening. And we're not talking about the possibility of things carrying on fine, the cough being insignificant. And we express danger in those terms. Perhaps that's what we mean when we talk about things being dangerous. That's all we're interested in. We're interested in the possibility of the bad. We're not interested in the idea that things can be fine. But this has some kind of serious effects on our perception of ordinary risks. So I'm sure a few people have seen this sort of headline in the papers, or this sort of story. The idea that if you do X, then you'll die a horrible death, essentially. And there is this relative risk, but it's relative to what? It's relative to the people to whom the stuff happens. Because a 20% increase in risk is a 20% increase over what? What's the initial risk of contracting colorectal cancer in a lifetime, of having colorectal cancer in a lifetime? Well, it's about 5 in 100 for men. So a 20% increase over 5 is 6. So you're talking about 1 extra case in 100. If all 100 men eat about 3 extra rashers of bacon every day for the rest of their lives. So that's your 20% increase in risk. Now, what have we done there? We framed the risk in terms of the people to whom stuff happens. Is there an alternative? There is, actually. There is an alternative. We can express it as an absolute risk. We can interpret it as natural frequencies. I'm going to show you this as icons. So you can see this a little better now. You can see the 5 people who we'd expect to get it ordinarily. There are 100. We give them all. We force feed them all extra bacon for the rest of their lives, and we find that there's 1 extra case. And that's our 20%. But we can see that we're speaking about this character. We're speaking about the risk in terms of the events, rather than the non-events. What does it mean? What could it possibly mean to speak about these things in terms of non-events? Well, we could do what's known as framing it positively. We could just bring to the foreground the people who are fine. We could even convert it to a relative risk where we say the chance of being fine reduces from 95 out of 100 to 94 out of 100, a reduction of 1% in your chance of being fine if you consume vast quantities of bacon for the rest of your life. So now that's not really a story. Being all right, nothing happening. Let's just do one more little thing. Let's put David in here. Okay, so we're going to try and kill David with bacon now, as many Davids, because 100 possible lives for David here, and there we go. We'll randomize them as well, because it's quite interesting to see what these different representations do to your sense of the odds. So even randomizing them like that, even spreading things out a bit like that, tends to cause people to feel that it's less threatening. You know, and then you stand there with your, your dart, and you just think, that one, in all these various possible lives. So I think the relationship between storytelling and the data is intriguing. I think there are inherent things about the way that we tell ourselves stories, the way that we put ourselves into those stories, the way that the media represent things in terms of stories, that both draw attention to particular things, but frame the whole perception of danger in a particular way.
So I'm going to talk about the other end of it. I'm in the maths department. I did maths and statistics. That's what I do. So I come at the whole business of turning numbers into stories. Michael's talked about, how can we tell stories, bring numbers into stories, and I'm doing the other way around. How can we turn numbers into stories? So there's the plug. And what we use in the book quite a lot are ways which we think might be quite gripping, provide gripping narratives, and yet provide a realistic way of communicating small risks that actually are there. I'm going to tend to talk about small risks, millions and things like that. And I did a TV program, and they said, oh, you've got to do something dangerous. And I said, can I swim with sharks? And they said, no. And I said, well, Brian Cox got to swim with sharks. And they said, you're not Brian Cox, which is true. And we've only got 400 quid. So that was it. And so I jumped out of an airplane. I did a skydive for this program. Tandem skydive. They strapped me to someone and literally pushed me out of the plane, screaming, and that was it. But before I did it, I thought, what's the risk? Am I going to die? How likely am I to die? So I'm a statistician, so I go and look at the evidence. And interestingly, if you go to the British Parachuting Association website, now, they don't put this data on the very front of the website. But if you click away and really search down, you find it eventually. You find this lovely Excel spreadsheet, which has got all the deaths. And here we are for the last 20 years, 4.6 million jumps, 48 deaths. So almost exactly about 1 in 100,000 or 10 in a million. On average, with going up on the plane and things like that, I thought there was around about 7 or 10 in a million chance of me dying. There's 50 million people in England and Wales around about. Every day, 50 of them have accidental or violent deaths. That's just the way it is. 17,000 a year meet a sudden death, not to do with their health. So a couple are murdered a day if you're run over, some people fall off ladders, etc., etc. So that's a 1 in a million. So we're all, our daily dose of acute risk is a micromort roundabout. So jumping out of the plane is only about a week's worth. Yeah. And actually, in terms of overall mortality, at my age, 59, it's 7,000 micromorts a year in terms of my chance of dying. So an extra 7 on 10 on top of that, well, do it every day. Well, I won't do it every day, but I thought it's worthwhile doing it, doing it once. I'm not worried, that's fine. Makes far more sense. Actually, I'm not quite sure about the rationality of this, but I believe it makes far more sense to take more and more extreme risks as you get older, because it's a smaller proportion of the bit that you've got left. But I'm not sure. Maybe Michael's arguing about relative risks is something we ought to watch out there. But okay, so I did it, and I survived, and that's it. So the point is, though, that you can make these comparisons quite easy. So, hang gliding is about 8, running a marathon is about 7, scuba diving is about 5, base jumping is at least 400. Now, so we do, in the book, we make all these comparisons and say this is helpful, which we do believe. That's acute, tiny risk. Things are going to kill you on the spot. Now, what about the other sort of risks? Now, this is my idea of a night out. I have unsophisticated tastes. I'm very cheap maintenance. Well, you can have your spam fritter or whatever for 90p from this Liverpool chip shop. Now that is not going to kill you on the spot. Well, it might, if you really, you might choke on your spam fritter, but it's pretty unlikely it's going to kill you on the spot. So it's a different sort of risk. These are chronic risks. These are going to things that will, if you carry on at them, are likely to shorten your life. So how can we express these? And these are the ones that newspapers tend to get terribly wrong. Okay, now this is a nice curve. This is called a hazard curve. And it's a great curve. This is the chance of dying before your next birthday, on average. And it's on a scale, sort of logarithmic scale, so 10%, 1 in 10. So if you're about 83, 1 in 10 83-year-olds will not see 84. 1%, 1 in 160, oh God, that's nearly me. Well, 1 in 100 people like me will not see their next birthday. 1 in 1,000 32-year-olds, and 1 in 10,000 7-year-olds. And there is this sort of lump here, sadly, jumping up at 17, as you can imagine, for boys. This is a sort of risk-taking lump. But if you ignored that lump, if you look up there, there's a dead straight line between 70 and 90. It's quite extreme, 7 and 90. There's something about our bodies, and this was discovered by Gompertz in 1825. There's something about our bodies, the way that they age, that means that every year our chance of dying increases by the same amount, 9%. When epidemiologists, like my colleagues, do studies, when they follow lots of people for years, they measure the effect of various habits in terms of hazard ratios. This is what it does to your hazard every year. So if you have a daily sausage or a bacon sandwich, this goes up by about 10%, a fixed amount, for if you do that as your daily risk, your annual risk. So a 10% increase on your annual risk of death, of not making your next birthday. These relative risks that epidemiologists report, as Michael has so ably shown, tend to get really badly reported in the newspapers. So this is in the Daily Express, we've got findings about less meat, more veg is the secret of a longer life, which is probably, could well be the case, but the way they report it, they said if we cut down the amount of red meat they eat, 10% of all deaths could be avoided. Isn't that amazing? Isn't stats wonderful? 10% of all, so 10% of us will live forever eating nuts. So this is not true. 10% of all deaths will not be avoided. I'm afraid this is absolutely. Well, they're talking about relative risk, but they don't understand them. They don't know how to report them. So we've been trying to think of another metaphor for it. And the one we caught hold of is this metaphor of speed of aging. So it's turning these numbers, rather bold numbers, quite difficult to understand, into stories. And the story we've got is getting older, quicker, or aging slower. And it turns out, though, that, as I mentioned, Gompertz's observation said that between the ages of 25 and 80, your risk of dying increased by about 9% per year. Actually, that means that every 8 years, your risk of dying doubles, essentially. 25 to 33, it doubles. 33 to 41, it doubles. 41 to 49, it doubles. And it's going to get you in the end. Mathematics proves it. You can't go on forever because it's this exponential increase in risk. Amazing, really powerful. It's going to. That's why you peg out in the end. It's going to get you. That change in life expectancy is not that gripping in itself. So what we've done in the book, we've done this rather strange thing. We say that, well, over an adult lifetime, about 50 years, 50, 60 years or something like that. Taking a year off your life is like losing roughly a 50th of your life. That's actually pro rata, because of these habits, these daily habits. It's actually pro rata like losing a week every year of your life. Same as losing half an hour off a day. So we could say, in fact, that this, 2 hours watching television, is essentially it's as if it's taking half an hour off your life. Those 2 hours are taking half an hour off your life. You're aging an extra half an hour through sitting on your backside watching television. There's a nice thing about half an hour, because an adult life expectancy, 55 to 60 years or something like that, is actually 1.5 million hours. 1.5 million hours is 57 years. So you have got, not all of you, I'm afraid, some of you have got 1.5 million hours to fritter away somehow. Okay, so yeah, one of the other things we do in the book is talk about radiation, and this is one of some quite slightly shocking things that one can do. That you can say exposure to radiation. You can talk in terms of microlives or cigarette equivalents. So, for example, a flight to New York, the radiation you get from that is about equivalent to smoking a couple of cigarettes, about half an hour of your life for flying to New York. That's why, when people were considering evacuating Tokyo for Fukushima, they were going to get a higher radiation exposure leaving Tokyo than they would have by staying in there, because they weren't getting into Fukushima. These are perhaps the most shocking ones, which we talk about in that. The whole body CT scan. People, you can get one of these for £1,000 as long as you don't mind exposing yourself to, a healthy dose of, or possibly an unhealthy dose of radiation, and 150 microlives, smoking about 300 cigarettes. Exactly the same as if you were standing about, 1.5 miles from the Hiroshima explosion. So they don't. I don't know why. When they advertise these things for £1,000, they don't tell you that. I can't see why. That's transparent risk communication. Yes, you know, have the time of your life. So we've got a huge table in these that runs from the bag of Brazil nuts or the banana and things like that, showing all these equivalents. And again, it's because all of these things are sort of using the numbers to tell perhaps more almost unacceptable stories. David Nutt got into trouble for comparing taking ecstasy with the risk of horse riding, or what he said, the addiction to horse riding, which he called equasy. And he said that ecstasy and equasy are about the same risk. And yeah, roughly, we reckon ecstasy is about 3 micromorts a tablet, roughly 2 or 3. And horse riding is probably a bit less than that, depending on what you do. Eventing's a lot more, and it depends how you ride, maybe. But they're not dissimilar. So we can compare hang gliding with taking heroin. We can compare, you know, healthy treatments with standing next to Hiroshima. We're deliberately doing these, using these numbers to tell uncomfortable stories. Chances and probabilities and risk, it is really difficult. Probability was only invented a few hundred years ago. It's not a natural way to think at all. It's extremely difficult and complex. Anything that can help people do it is a benefit. Now, the psychologists have got hold of this lovely idea of why we're trying to do it. Now, I don't know, you know, I don't care what people do, so I don't want to change what they do particularly. I don't even, you know, it'd be nice if they could remember it, you know, get the gist of something, nice if they could learn something, but I don't even care too much about that. The psychologists have got hold of this great scheme of what perhaps you're really trying to do, which is trying to breed some immunity to misleading anecdote, which is this business, as you said, of the fact we're so influenced by idiotic stories we hear on the web or from our friends and neighbours. Misleading anecdote is someone who smokes 20 a day and lives till 110, who buys some tablets off the web and their cancer goes away. You know, these are not representative. They're not representative stories that Michael's talking about. So this is an active area of research, and it's been shown that if you present information in the way that Michael was presenting, as icon arrays to show both the good and the bad, show the totality, it's shown empirically that you can make people be less influenced by misleading anecdotes. And thank you very much indeed.